All right, I'm excited to get going here. About a year ago, Jake Keeling gave me my very own pointer, laser pointer, and it's green. So I tried it out in the class over in the fellowship hall there, and I shined it on the screen, and it was so bright it kind of bounced back and about blinded everyone. So I'm going to give it a try today because the screens are a little further away, and I think it'll come in handy. Of course, it's not a double pointer, so I can only point at one screen at the same time. But anyway, we'll make it through. Anyway, so I think I know everybody in here. Y'all know me. I'm Barrett Vanlandingham. I am your family life and involvement minister. Glad to be here. Chris Wilson, in charge of our curriculum and teachers and so forth, said it's time to grow up and start teaching adults, so here I am. No, he didn't say that. I've been teaching over there some, but I will say there is something about teaching back in the youth room on the topic of peer pressure for the last 20 years, and then having to get into a little bit more meat. Not that wasn't important; that was very important to my audience, but this has been a really, really fun study. I'll be in here for the next 8 weeks on the topic of the life of Joshua. So today I'm going to give you an overview of that, and then in the remaining 7 weeks we'll get more specific on some of the really neat things about it. The story of Joshua, the life of Joshua, really mirrors in many ways that of Jesus himself. It's kind of a shadow of, or a foreshadowing of the story of Jesus, and I was reminded of that when Justin was talking this morning. But again, it mirrors the story of Jesus. It's about a guy who submits to the will of someone who is his mentor. In Joshua's case, he's submitting to the will and the teachings of Moses, who submitted to the will and teachings of God. And he's taking a group of people into the promised land. So obviously there are some parallels there as well with Jesus. And so this is a really exciting book. Now, he didn't start out to be quite the spiritual leader that he ended up being, but we'll get to all that. So here is a representation of Joshua. I'm not sure what he's doing there, talking to God, it looks like. I don't know. It's an artist rendering of a representation of Joshua. So there he is. His story takes place in about 1400 BC. You probably, when you think of Joshua, you probably have a story in mind. There's a lot of really good ones. He's found all over the Old Testament and some different places in the New Testament as well. Probably this would be one of the most famous depictions of Joshua. Anybody know what he's doing there? Jericho for the win. Yes, Daryl. Jericho. And so we'll get into more of the specifics on that. Jericho was the very first place after he led the children of Israel across the Jordan River. That was the first place that they had to conquer during the conquest of Canaan, as God promised Abraham and then Moses and Joshua. That they would be, that their ancestors, their people would go into Canaan's land, the promised land. One of the most encouraging things, I think, about a study of the life of Joshua is that we get to see God at work in a very special way, following through on his promises to Joshua, and before him, Moses, and before him, Abraham, about 600, 700 years maybe before Joshua led them into the promised land. And God was telling Abraham about what would happen several hundred years before that. And so getting to see God follow through on the promises to them and to the nation of Israel, that when they stayed faithful and obedient to God, that he stays faithful to him and to them and follows through with the rewards that he promised. Here is kind of the general area that we're talking about here. You see there the green area at the top left. Not that you need a pointer for that, but since I have it, there we go. The land of Goshen, that's where the children of Israel were. They had been there for roughly 400 years. Part of that, they were in Egyptian captivity. And then the rest of the story then takes place when Moses then comes to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, out of the hand of Pharaoh, and on to the promised land. And then the 40 years in the middle of that, where they're wandering around in the wilderness area, the desert wilderness area, trying to become the kind of people that God wants them to be. So this is kind of the area that we're talking about here. You see the land of Goshen, very fertile area up there with the Nile going right through it. Egypt. Then you have the wilderness there on the right, up there by the little blue spot right there. That is the Dead Sea. So about right there where the S is of Philistines, that'd be Beersheba. That would be where Jacob and his sons started out before they wound up coming to the land of Goshen, courtesy of their brother Joseph, who at that point they had already sold him into slavery, and through a course of events he winds up becoming the governor of Egypt of all things. And so he feels pity on him and lets him stay, gets the Pharaoh to let him stay in the land of Goshen. The promised land would be off to the right there above the Dead Sea and what would be considered Israel. You see Mount Sinai down there. Not for sure really if that's where it is. There's some different views on that. It could either be there or it might be over here. So not that it really matters in that case. So it's interesting when you look at Joshua, because it's have you ever heard somebody say, you remind me of your mother, or you're just like your mother, or you're just like your dad, or you remind me so and so, or you're two peas in a pod. Well, that's kind of what we're looking at here. This is Moses, and the younger guy there is Joshua. And so that's kind of what Joshua's life was like, was to imitate Moses as Moses then took on the teachings and the commands of God as well. So these are the powerful words that came from God and were passed down. They were passed from God to Moses and then down to Joshua from Exodus chapter 19. Let me read that. So these are the words that were passed down to Joshua, because ultimately that's who winds up taking the children of Israel into the promised land. It starts out with Moses, but he doesn't wind up getting to do that in the end. He gets to see it from afar from the top of Mount Nebo, but he didn't actually get to go into the land, and we'll talk about why later on that. On the first day of the third month, so they've only been out of Egypt for 2 full months, right, when this happens here. So on the first day of the third month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day they came to the desert of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim. That's a city or place right outside of Mount Sinai, really close to it. A lot of different things happened there. We'll talk about later, including when Moses struck the rock. That's where battles happened. So it is a significant place. They entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. You see all the people there. They're camped in front of the mountain. There they are. That's exactly what it looked like. Yes. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." And when he says, "You see for yourself what I did to Egypt," that would be the understatement of the century, of a lifetime. He did a lot of things to Egypt. It was self-inflicted on the Pharaoh's part, but yeah, there was a lot of things that happened there that we'll talk about later too. And then how Moses was able to lead the children of Israel out of Pharaoh's grasp there. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So Moses went back and summoned the elders and the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. And I have this next one underlined here, verse 8, because it says, the people all responded together, we will do everything the Lord has said. So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. And the reason I underline that is because so many times, and I've taught it this way too in the past, so many times you hear that the friction there between God and the children of Israel, God's chosen people, is that God chose them, but they didn't choose God back. And I guess in some ways that is true, but right here you have it in writing. The covenant was presented by God. The people all responded together, we will do everything the Lord has said. They chose to enter into this covenant with God. So it wasn't that they did not choose to be into a covenant with God. It's that much like us today, we choose, don't we, to enter into a covenant with God. When we put on Christ in baptism, we make that choice to go into that relationship with Jesus Christ. And then just like the Israelites, sometimes we don't exactly get it right as life goes on. And so, yeah, they all responded together, we will do everything the Lord has said. They didn't do everything the Lord had said. They tried, it didn't work out many times. Life went on, and there were some difficult things that happened because of the seeds that they planted, because of the decisions that they made. They had it really tough for centuries after that, because some of the things that God wanted them to do during the conquest, I guess, of the Promised Land, they didn't manage to fulfill that. They didn't manage to wipe out all the Canaanites from the land like they were supposed to. Sometimes they let things continue on that they shouldn't have, and as a result, they wound up kind of taking on some of the ways of the people that they were around, getting too cozy with the enemy that God told them that they shouldn't get cozy with, but they did anyway. And so there were consequences to pay for that. So going on here, Joshua was a great military leader, mainly because he was a great spiritual leader. And he was obedient to God's instructions on how to lead Israel. Moses chose Joshua to take his place 40 years later after this started here, just before Moses died, because God chose Joshua. So Moses wasn't just choosing him on his own. God had chosen him, and so Moses chose him as well. And Moses wanted to do what God wanted him to do. And so that was the example that he set before Joshua also. The reason why studying the life of Joshua, I believe, is so important is this. It shows what good spiritual leadership looks like, and we also get to see God's justice at work and God's mercy at work. Most people, I think, who criticize the Bible and the Old Testament in particular, they look at some twisted version of God's justice, and they look at it more like it's God's injustice, don't they? And so they like to point the finger at this awful God who likes to kill people all the time. And that's not exactly the whole story there. So we're going to talk about more about that in a future lesson. But today I just want to introduce Joshua. Joshua has a book named after him. It's a book of victory and encouragement because of Joshua's choice to live his life in service and obedience to God. In chapter 1, Joshua is commissioned by God to take over the leading of the Israelites into the promised land after Moses' death. And then about 25 years later, in the last chapter there of Joshua, he gives an encouraging speech to those that he had led for so many years, and then he dies. And then Judges takes over. Spoiler alert, he dies. So the book of Joshua is his journal of God's movement in his life as he strives to live faithfully. The life of Joshua includes more than just the book of Joshua. Just like if you were to write a book about your career or what an average day in your life was like, that would be much different than a story about your life as a whole, which would include a whole lot of other things. So I was going to take a look at a few of these slides here. These are artist renderings, just as we kind of begin to immerse ourselves in the life of Joshua. Here's an artist rendering of one of the stories. Can anybody guess what's going on there? Yeah, the return of the spies. Okay, so there was 12 spies that Moses sent out. 10 of them came back with reports that, we're doomed. They're bigger and scarier. We're like grasshoppers in their sight. And then the other two came back with positive reports. Who were they? Joshua and Caleb. Yes, so they came back. So I'm guessing that is Joshua and Caleb. I'm not for sure which one of those is Joshua and which one's Caleb. Doesn't really matter, I guess. Of course, after class, someone will probably tell me, it was obvious which one was which there. But what do they have on that pole? Grapes. So that's just like one bunch of grapes. That's a big bunch of grapes, isn't it, that they're carrying on that pole. And that was kind of the proof that they were supposed to bring back of what was going on there, that it really was a beautiful land flowing with milk and honey, a prosperous land, a fertile land, a place that would be good for them and one that they should desire. Of course, then the other 10 were scared of it because they saw, all they could see really were the giants and the scariness of everything that was going on there. And so that winds up with some bad consequences because of their lack of faith and obedience. I really don't think that the end of that story in particular was supposed to be that way. I think what was supposed to happen was this was really a victory lap. I mean, just think about what had happened. Moses had already led the children of Israel across the Red Sea on dry land. They had already had manna and quail every day. God fed them. They'd gotten to see a lot of incredible things. So by that point, they had already seen God work in some amazing ways. And so I think this really was supposed to be a time for the spies, who they weren't just random people. Each of the spies were actually leaders of their own tribes. And so you have Joshua, who was a leader of Ephraim, and you have Caleb, who was a leader of Judah, and then all the other spies as well. And so I think this was supposed to be a time where they get to go out, they see it, it'll be a challenge, but they're going to come back and get the people riled up. We're ready to go. We know that God's going to go before us. We know that we're going to be victorious. This is going to be a great thing here. But things didn't go as planned because, as usual, people get in the way. Just kind of shot themselves in the foot there a little bit. Okay, so what's going on here? Normally when you see great numbers of people going across a situation like that, you've got two walls of water. Where are they? Right there. The Jordan River, yes. So they did go across another place there. It wasn't just the Red Sea. They went across the Jordan River. And so that was the river that they had to cross in order to go camp out at Gilgal for a night and then raid, spend the next several days in the conquest of their first target, which was Jericho. Jericho it is. So here we have soldiers going around a particular city. Again, what city is that they're marching around? Jericho, yes. There is an artist's rendering of Joshua pointing at the sun, pointing at the sky. Anybody have any idea of what that's about? Huh? Yeah, the time when Joshua, well, basically the Gibeonites who Joshua was deceived into going into a treaty with. So basically he agreed to be in a partnership with them, even though he wasn't supposed to do that. He was deceived into doing that, but he's following through with his word. And so when the 5 Amorite kings decide to do a big raiding party and go to war against the Gibeonites, then the Gibeonites then call Joshua and say, hey, we can't do this alone. You Israelites need to come help us out. So he goes over to help them out. And so at some point then he asks God to put the sun and the moon on hold a little bit to give them more daylight time so that they can adequately beat down the Amorites and those associated with them. Here we have a big bunch of people, so I'm assuming that would be the Israelites. That might be Joshua out front, or maybe just someone who wanted to stand in the front. But no, that's the witnessing of God commissioning Joshua in front of all the people. Moses commissioning, actually, Joshua in front of all the people. And then God would then also commission Joshua over kind of in a more private setting in front of the tent of meeting. So you have God choosing Joshua, Moses then giving his blessing to Joshua to carry on with business and leading the children of Israel into the promised land. But then you have God also giving him his blessing and commissioning him in that. So, Joshua is mentioned in several books of the Old Testament and the New. Here's kind of a list of those. So, I think Joshua, to me, in my mind, he's probably one of the most underplayed people that we read about. I think even though he has his own book named after him, I do think that he's probably one of the most underplayed people as far as everything, because you see how many different books he's in: Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Chronicles, Nehemiah, and then even in the New Testament in a couple of places there. I just think that there's so many great stories in the Old Testament. Sometimes Joshua gets overlooked, and there's just so many stories about Joshua. Sometimes we forget that there are more awesome stories about him that we can learn from. So for the purposes of this series of 8 lessons, I'm going to try to give you a better idea of what Joshua's life was like, and also answer the question of why 3,500 years later we should even care about the life of Joshua. This is all Old Testament stuff, so why should we care about that? What can we learn from that? And so we're going to discover some things about Joshua's life that we can learn from that will make a positive difference in our lives if we learn from those things and apply them. And so I think that you're going to find this to be true no matter what stage of life that you're in. There's some fascinating stories of people stepping up and doing some amazing things that required a lot of faith and bravery, and they were, in their 80s or above. Also, one of the most underplayed people that we're going to hear about in these stories about Joshua is Caleb, who you mentioned a while ago. He's amazing too. He was quite a leader in his tribe as well. So first, let's lay a little bit more groundwork. What we know about the life of Joshua. So we've already mentioned he's from the tribe of Ephraim. Why is that significant? Well, in some cases, the nation of Israel was actually referred to as, the nation of Ephraim. It had that much significance. They were that powerful. They were that big. They were that important, largely because of the cities of Shechem and Shiloh were located there. Those were major religious centers, so there's lots of goings on there, people coming and going there. And so the spotlight was on Ephraim, which was also geographically located right in the middle of Canaan's land. You had land that was allotted above that and below that, and they're right there in the middle. It was a great location for people to be able to come to those religious centers of Shechem and Shiloh located there. And again, with Joshua being a leader from the tribe of Ephraim, I guess that might explain possibly why Shechem and Shiloh took on such prominence as well. He was the son of Nun, N-U-N. So Nun was his dad. Elishama was his granddad. Amihud was his great-grandfather. Interesting thing about Elishama, and I don't speak Hebrew, so I have no idea if I'm saying these names right or not, but Elishama was also a leader of the tribe of Ephraim, because when you're reading about the story and about them moving from the Red Sea out of there and the goings on, and then going down and fighting the battle at Rephidim against the Amalekites, and then going up the mountain, Mount Sinai and everything, and then after about a year or so at Mount Sinai, well, then it's time for him to move on to the next leg of the journey and start sending spies into the land after that. But Elishama was the one, and I thought it was interesting, who was the leader of the tribe of Ephraim from Mount Sinai when they left there to go on to their next place. He was the one who is listed as leading the tribe of Ephraim. And so that's kind of a big deal. So I see a lot of intergenerational leadership, mentorship. So there was lots of this going on. You have Moses mentoring Joshua. You have Elishama, the grandfather, evidently a leader of Ephraim, able to lead in that capacity. And why, at this point, Joshua would have not been chosen to lead the children of the tribe of Ephraim from Mount Sinai on, I'm not exactly for sure. This was fairly early in his story, though. So I don't know. Can you think of any reason why Joshua wouldn't have been the one to lead the tribe of Ephraim then from that location on to the next leg of the journey, and instead Elishama, the grandfather, doing that? What are your thoughts about that? It is possible. We don't exactly know Joshua's age at that point. We know that he was in the process of becoming a great spiritual leader, but he may not have been seen as a great spiritual leader, or maybe the guy that everybody would look to lead them as a whole in that way. Although, we find out that pretty early on, at least Moses looked at him as a great warrior. So that was the first thing. All right, a few other things. He was born into Egyptian slavery. So what did he do for a living? What did he do? I don't know. He may have been a brick maker, like so many of the other Hebrew people were, making bricks there in the land of Goshen. Beautiful place. Had the Nile River running through it. Very fertile. Lots of farming going on and everything, but nevertheless, they are still in Egypt. And at some point, after 400 years of them being there, the Israelites grew to be such a massive force to be reckoned with that one of the new pharaohs, they didn't know the deal that had been struck with them to let them live peacefully there in the land of Goshen. So that's when they kind of started coming down on them hard and putting them into slavery and making them make bricks. And then at some point they made them make the same amount of bricks every day, but without straw. I've never made a brick, but I'm guessing their recipe required straw. So either to hold it together better or made it easier to make them or whatever. But he would have been born into Egyptian slavery like everybody else who was living in Goshen at that time. More than likely, he would have been born close to the end of their time, close to the end of that 400 years, because he was still a youth. He was still a young man when they left the land of Goshen, and Moses led them out of there. And then just a few days later, you have Moses calling on him to put together a warring party to go launch a counterattack against the Amalekites. We'll talk more about that. He was Moses' aide from his youth. In Numbers 11, we find that out. He was a leader of the tribe of Ephraim that I mentioned. Also, what else do we know about the life of Joshua? He defeated the Amalekites. That's really about the first thing that we read about of him leading a warring party against someone there. And this was one that was really prophesied like 600 or 700 years before, back in Genesis 15:16, when God was talking to Abraham and making the promise to Abraham about where his descendants would go. He said that they're going to wind up in a place that's going to be hostile to them for 400 years, but that it's going to be a fourth generation group of Israelites that are going to wind up going into the promised land, which is exactly what happened. So many times, people who are against or who want to criticize the violence in the Old Testament, especially in the book of Joshua, where a lot of that takes place, they're always pointing fingers at Joshua, wondering, why did all this violence take place? Why was he allowed to do all that and just, wipe people out? But if you would have been an Israelite living at the time and on this journey, you would have been asking the question, why didn't God do this sooner? So really, this is a story not just about God taking vengeance on a group of people who just did some awful things. These were not nice people. The Canaanite people and all the groups that were associated with them, the Amorites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, all those, about 7 of them, 7 groups right there that were all kind of, those names are kind of under the umbrella of Canaanites. So he defeated the Amalekites 2 years into the journey, and so this would be really before the 40 years of wandering started, or at least at the beginning of it. So this is where Moses asks Joshua to launch this counterattack because the Amalekites are attacking them. And so that was kind of a big deal because this is really before a lot of the other things took place. So why? This goes back to what we were talking about a while ago. How did Moses decide that Joshua had this kind of leadership and that he could trust him in this way? So there must have been something about Joshua that Moses could pick him out of a million people or whatever it was at that time and say, okay, you're the one who's going to start leading us militarily. You're going to be my military general, and this is going to be the first thing that you're going to do right here. And this is actually before he ever was chosen to be a spy to go into the land by Moses. 5 minutes. Wow, that went by fast. Here's a neat thing that I guess would be easy to forget about that's important, that Joshua actually went up Mount Sinai to go get the 10 Commandments. I think we forget about that. I mean, there are some theories that maybe he stopped halfway up or something like that, but the fact is, it says in a couple of places that Joshua went up with Moses to go get the 10 Commandments, because then it also says on the way back down, you have Joshua and Moses saying, hey, this sounds like the sounds of war down there. What's going on? And so there's a conversation going on between Moses and Joshua after, when they were on their way back down with the 10 Commandments. And so that's kind of a neat thing. So you're starting to see this relationship between Moses and Joshua take a turn from just being military to being military with a spiritual, with faith growing on the part of Joshua. Because he's already being asked to defend them against the Amalekites, and then as time goes on against many others. But so he starts out with that quality. So he had some leadership qualities about him, though he was young. And then the rest of the time is him sticking right by Moses' side and learning how to be a spiritual leader as well. And that is how Joshua then became a great leader. It wasn't just because he was so great in the military. It was that he trusted God, and he was a great spiritual leader as well. He stayed at the tent where God spoke to Moses. Anytime he wasn't with Moses, he was the kind of the protector, the guardian of the tent. And when I say the tent, I mean the tent of meeting. I'm assuming this would be the precursor, the predecessor to the tabernacle. What they used is that, a place where God would speak to Moses as one friend speaks to another. The scripture says Hoshea was actually Joshua's name. Joshua's name, Joshua and Jesus had the same name. So there's so many similarities. So besides the fact that they kind of had the same mission, but one was a long time before the other, they actually also had the same name. So Hoshea means save or salvation. And so if you had a t-shirt, if Hoshea had a t-shirt, Joshua, it would be, kind of like, it might say something like, I'm a pretty big deal. I'm a pretty big deal. But then when Moses then chooses Hoshea then to lead the children of Israel, then he changes his name. Actually, he changes his name really early on when he sent the 12 spies out. He began calling him Yehoshua, or Joshua in English, before sending the 12 spies into Jericho. As you can read there, Joshua is the personal name of the God of Israel, and Shah means salvation or to save. So Joshua's name signifies Yahweh is salvation. Obviously, that would be an important thing to start getting into Joshua's head early on in this wandering. So he's not just Joshua saves or save, because he knew, that he was militarily, that his job was to help save the Israelites. But now Moses is helping him understand that any success that he has isn't going to be because of his great might. It's going to be because Yahweh is salvation. Yahweh saves. Okay, let's pause for a word of prayer, and we'll see you back here next week. Dear God, we love you very much, and we're so thankful for this time that we could come together and learn about one of your great servants. God, we just want to lift your name up this week in our lives as we strive to more fully commit to what you would have us to do. Help us to always be the kind of people that you would have us to be. It's in your Son's name. Amen.